Intolerance is one of the superlative masterworks of the cinema, but its director, D.W. Griffith, has become, from being one of the gods of the cinema, to being somebody who really upsets a lot of people, mostly because of The Birth of a Nation and the racial question. But people have suggested that Intolerance is his apology for The Birth of a Nation. But believe me, Griffith did not think he had anything to apologize for. And the curious thing is, with all the examples of intolerance he shows, he doesn't include the greatest of all, perhaps, which is racial prejudice. He started with a regular 5-reel picture called Mother and the Law, about a boy facing execution for a crime he didn't commit. And he felt this wasn't right to follow. The public would not expect a potboiler after the staggering success of The Birth of a Nation, which still stands as perhaps the most financially successful film in film history. So he added to this tale of injustice, the massacre of the Huguenots, the crucifixion of Christ, and the fall of Babylon. And I remember the assistant cameraman, Carl Brown, told me he thought it very amusing that Griffith didn't know what to call each picture. He just called it Mother and the Law 2, Mother and the Law 3, Mother and the Law 4. So perhaps he didn't intend to intercut the way he did in the end and to follow each story individually. But as he worked on them, he realized what he had to do with the footage, which was incredibly difficult. And Griffith put in the program note, events are not set forth in their historical sequence, but as they might flash across a mind seeking to parallel the life of the different ages. The trouble was, the 4 stories came to a climax in a hail of images which the audience couldn't follow. And some critic at the time said one was fearful that Belshazzar was going to be run over by an automobile. Griffith had been attacked by reformers, and he couldn't stand reformers anyway. And they were his main target in Mother and the Law. But the curious thing was that he was a reformer himself. He attacked capital punishment in Mother and the Law. He attacked prohibition in the crucifixion story, and religious intolerance in the Huguenot story. But the most extraordinary thing for 1915, when he shot this picture, is he singled out John D. Rockefeller, perhaps the most famous man in America, as the villain, the capitalist villain of the modern story. Now, Rockefeller, he felt was, well, indeed, he had been responsible for the Ludlow massacre when strikers at a mine were machine gunned by the National Guard. Their camp was machine gunned, set alight, and 11 children and 2 pregnant women were killed. And this was blamed by the left on Rockefeller. And we know, if you were alive in that period, you would recognize who it was meant to be immediately, because the man playing the part picks up a coin from the sidewalk, and Rockefeller always said that was the start of his fortune. No wonder it appealed to the Russians when they saw it. They were absolutely overwhelmed. They'd never seen American authority so attacked on the screen, and Lenin offered Griffith the chance to run the Russian film industry. Griffith used no script. He kept it all up here. And he trained a mass of assistant directors. There turned out to be the next great tranche of directors in the 30s and 40s, people like Victor Fleming, who made Gone with the Wind, W.S. Van Dyke, who made San Francisco, Sidney Franklin, who made The Good Earth. In fact, Sidney Franklin told me something about this picture, which is worth repeating. He said, there were 1,000 idiots on the walls of Babylon throwing down burning oil and big rocks made of plaster of Paris. Well, if one of them hit you, it could kill you. They were dropping so many things that no one could get to the walls. I was in charge of a group of 500, and since I was out in front, I made a speech. Come on, boys, don't be afraid to approach the walls. Follow me. I'd no sooner got the words out of my mouth than a rock came hurtling from 50 feet up and struck my shield. The shield knocked me cold, and my 500 extras went the other way. My mother came across from the studio and said, "Is my son in there?" "Yes," they told her. "His brains are all over the lot." The film was influenced by a magnificent Italian production which had been going on for a year or two in production called Cabiria. And when Griffith saw it, he was heard to mutter, "I wonder how the hell they did that damn thing." He was particularly intrigued by the moving camera. The Cabiria director moved the camera an incredible number of times through this great epic, and moving camera was virtually unknown in 1912 when he began work on it. But Griffith felt that it attracted attention to itself and made the audience aware of the technique, and American filmmakers were usually very reluctant to draw attention to technique. They wanted you to be lost in the picture, and it should be, the technique should be unnoticed. So one thing that he did want to do, because he had to keep ahead of the competition, he decided the camera should, in effect, come out of the clouds, reveal Babylon from above, and slowly sink down to ground level. But how to do that? In England, we had historians who seemed to depend on mental telepathy rather than research, and they said that that was done by a captive balloon. Well, I met one of the fellows who was responsible for it, Alan Dwan. He sketched it out for Griffith, and it was rather like one of the siege towers that you see in the battle scenes. And curiously enough, no photograph survives of it. But it was a very tall tower in which an elevator had been built, and it was mounted on mining rails so that the huge thing could be pushed forward smoothly, and the elevator would descend, and you got the most extraordinary effect. And he did it in reverse as well. It was one of the great innovations of the picture. But it was also the editing. I remember working with an archivist called David Shepard at the American Film Institute, and we tracked down the editor of Intolerance, James Smith, who, with his wife Rose, had edited The Birth of a Nation as well. And we went to see him on one Sunday morning and knocked on the door. And this old man came to the screen door, which he didn't open, and we wondered if you would like to see Intolerance again, thinking he'd be thrilled. And he said, "I saw enough of that when I was cutting it." The Italian connection is remarkable. It's not just the fact that Griffith was so influenced by Cabiria and Quo Vadis, which preceded it, but he used Italian workmen who had been involved in the Pan-Pacific Exposition in San Francisco. And when he finished the picture and previewed it, he didn't want his name attached, which would make people expect something incredible. So he called himself Dante Giulio, DG being standing for David Griffith, but Dante Giulio, and the film was an Italian epic called Downfall of All Nations. I was 13 years old when I first saw Intolerance, and a very mischievous friend told me that during the battle scenes, one of the extras had had his head cut off by an over-enthusiastic warrior. Well, that shocked me. So when I saw the picture and I actually saw a soldier decapitated in front of my eyes, I thought it was real. Now you can see that it's fake. But I reacted, as audiences at the time must have reacted, with absolute horror. And I couldn't sleep for nights afterwards thinking of that terrible scene, that poor man. It was just papier-mâché. But it gave me a sense of the horrors of war more than any film I've ever seen. It turned me into a pacifist, as indeed it was intended to, because Griffith put more violent images into the battle scenes than any other films had. It was the second year of the European War. It looked as though America was going in. The Lusitania had been sunk, and perhaps one of the elements that made the picture unpopular with the public was this strong sense of the horrors of war. One night I was at the Maskers Club trying to get an interview with somebody who'd stood me up, and there was an old lady sitting near me who was staring at the pictures on the wall, and she said, "Who's that?" And I looked at the one she was looking at, and I said, "I think that's Fred Niblo." She said, "You shouldn't know that, you're far too young." I said, "I'm very interested in silent film directors." She said, "Well, I'm married to one." "But you'd never have heard of him." I said, "Who was it?" "Joseph Henneberry." I reacted with amazement, because Henneberry not only played Abraham Lincoln in The Birth of a Nation, he played 9 parts in Intolerance and was an assistant director throughout the whole thing. So she was so delighted that I knew him. We arranged the next day to go out to see him. And he was incredibly friendly and full of information, and told me all about the research that Griffith put into this picture. Now, you have to remember that Griffith was not a college-educated man. He was a farm boy who had educated himself. And when it came to the Babylonian scenes, he was absolutely determined to get them right. And he employed not just Henneberry, but several others, including the actress Lillian Gish, to find images of Babylon, find out information about it. I went recently to the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, which has gates of Babylon. It has a whole exhibit of Babylonian survivals. And all the time I was reminded of Intolerance and how accurate it was. Griffith even changed the noses of the players so that they would look more like the people of ancient Babylon, and gave the women false eyelashes, which actually started the craze in civilian life. The picture inspired European filmmakers Eisenstein, Pudovkin, who ended his career as a chemist and became a film director because of it, Jean Renoir, who turned to making films because he saw that film. And no one has ever made such a complex film again. Nobody ever dares to even think of doing what Griffith did. There were other directors at the time, Maurice Tourneur, Carl Dreyer, even Buster Keaton did a parody in which there are several stories, but none of them are intercut, because that is the most difficult thing you can possibly do. And when he reissued it, Griffith reissued it in separate stories, The Mother and the Law and The Fall of Babylon. And Carl Brown said that Griffith confided in him, "I wish I'd just made a Babylonian story." Now, when the picture came out, this is a Western Union telegram from Jesse Lasky to Cecil B. DeMille. And it's from New York, the New York premiere, September 6, 1916. Griffith picture Intolerance opened last night. It is being severely criticized on all sides, and opinion everywhere is that it does not compare with The Birth of a Nation. The lack of consecutive story is the picture's worst fault. In fact, it proved a disappointment as far as the first night audience was concerned. However, that part of the production which deals with the fall of Babylon is wonderful, and in my opinion, the picture will be a general success. Well, it wasn't really a general success because Griffith believed in presenting his pictures on a tremendous scale. He had huge orchestras, he road-showed them at high prices, and the public was disturbed by the film. I think they thought it way above their heads, and they couldn't identify with anybody in it particularly. Although it was full of stars and people who were going to become stars, Constance Talmadge became one of the finest comedians of the silent era. Some of the actors became directors, like Elmer Clifton. But overall, people will probably still find it as difficult now as they did in 1916, but it still packs a tremendous power. It's very beautiful, it's very moving, and as a piece of filmmaking, if you're interested in moving pictures, you cannot possibly afford to miss it. And you're seeing a very good print, and Carl Davis's score is magnificent. It has the effect of musically uniting all these disparate stories. And I remember when we showed it in London back in the 80s, we put on the poster the slogan, 3 hours that shook the world. And then slow fade out toward Griffith Iris.